faces. I do want to get thoughts from each of you today, and we'll see where this conversation goes for reasons why we should have hope for the future. But I want to go around each of you first and foremost and find out from the work that you do right now, what gives you a reason to be hopeful for the future? So, Hana, we'll start with you. What have you seen that makes you hopeful right now?
Every single day, I see evidence of the work of the Spirit. Every single day, no matter whether I'm standing in the reception at the Salvation Army or I'm down at the supermarket, I see the evidence that the Spirit is still moving. He's not gone on holiday. He's not left us or abandoned us. And so I think when you see that happening every single day, you see the Spirit bringing people together. You see the wisdom being brought forth from, people who have a voice to speak into things. That gives me hope every single day. And with that, when you add up every single day when the Spirit is working, we see so many lives that have been transformed and changed and different because of the work of the Spirit. So every single time, no matter how many times a tough thing happens, the moment you see something like that happen and continue, that just, of course, it's going to nurture hope within you.
Oh, I see. I love that. And you say, of course, as though it was a natural thing. But I think there's something about human nature, though, isn't there, where we can fixate on negative things. And I guess, Sam, as well, with your work with CAP, you have the potential to see the struggles that people face, and we can make it all about the struggles, but I'm sure you're seeing things as well that give you reason to be hopeful.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as you say, the struggle is real. That's we all see that every day pertaining to the line of work that CAP operates in. In terms of the daily, for us, it's a little bit of what Hana said there, he tangata, he tangata, he tangata. It is the opportunity that we have to engage with people who were in situations that they would themselves describe as hopeless, and now themselves sharing of their hope that they've got for the future, for them and their whānau, and what they're working towards, that I personally draw on for hope in each and every day. And I think alongside that, there's a lot of work right now that the team at Christians Against Poverty are putting into better understand the problems, better understand the challenge around us. And I think even in seeing the team wrestle through that and invest the time in that and centre those solutions around people, that as well gives me a heck of a lot of hope for where we're going.
Well, we're getting some great affirming nods in the studio right now too, by the way. So for those listening at home, a reminder, you'll be able to watch this a little bit later too, if you want to see the nods in question, if you head along to rema.co.nz a bit later on. But Tim, in your work with the Maxim Institute, tell me, do we have a reason to be hopeful this morning?
Oh, of course we have a reason to be hopeful because of the resurrection of our Lord and Saviour Jesus Christ. So absolutely we have a reason to be hopeful. At Maxim, it's one of the challenges. I do things like this quite often on different stations, and one of the challenges we make to ourselves is to say something unitive, generative, and hopeful, and it's not easy. I've got to say, sometimes it's not easy because it doesn't always feel hopeful. So I think we can put that in the context of, we think about optimism, we think about hope. Optimism is like, everything's going to be hunky-dory. Hope is something that can endure through suffering. Yeah. And there's a difference there. There's a difference there. And by the way, that's not my thought. I hang out with people who are a lot smarter than me for a living. But I think that's important to differentiate. And to Hana's point, and Sam's as well, the unexpected nature of the Spirit working and producing that hope. Like we started an internship last year, first time we'd done it in a while, and what was incredibly hopeful for us, we thought we were giving these young people something in politics, policy, etc., and it turns out they gave us so much. And I actually was in a meeting with an ex-Prime Minister with them, and he walked out of that meeting 2.5 hours, talked about failure, etc., all of the stuff and his own failures. He turned to me and said, that was one of the most stimulating meetings I've had in a long time. It's like, this is a collection of people in their 20s, a couple in their 30s, but one in their 30s. But the point being, I think if you've got the right lens to see hope, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, and I love that connection too with recognizing the difference between hope and optimism. And even too, coming back to your thoughts, Hana, that I think we do well to be reminded that even though there can be suffering, there can be hope at the same time. And I mean, I'm sure there's conversations as well that you have with people who cross your path where maybe this is something they need us to remind them of, that even though things might not be going well, it doesn't mean that it's kind of an either or situation, right?
Totally. And I think this comes to the point of, the word says that our testimony is like a weapon. And our being able to testify to going through tough stuff and God being present with us and doing whatever needs to be done, changing the situation, changing us, whatever, that testimony stuff. I think, about the fact that I was raised in Taita, in a state house. My mother was on a benefit. We never really had more than $1 or $2 left over at the end of all the bills. We never went on holiday. Someone kind and generous always paid for our school uniforms. And yet within that environment, my mum and myself have benefited from a legacy of faith. And so that's what generated the hope that was in my family and in my upbringing that, yep, things are not easy. However, we can do this because God is with us. And so, and then into my own years, many, many times in my own personal testimony, God has rescued me from some stuff that I would never have been able to get myself out of many times. And so I can speak from a place of testimony. I can share my testimony, and that's so powerful, and it generates hope in others even as they listen.
And it's an interesting tension to try and balance, I suppose, when you are in the world of struggle and difficulty that some people are in, that on the one hand, we need to be aware of what these challenges are. We don't want to pretend that everything's great and everything's fine. But then at the same time, to be able to present that message, Sam, how do you go about, passing the amount of info that can come your way, being aware of what the challenges are, and yet still trying to find that hopeful thing? Does it come naturally?
I think it can come naturally. I think there's certainly times where we'd be overwhelmed.
Sometimes you have to force it to come naturally.
Yeah, I think you got to choose it, eh? I think you still got to choose it. When Hana, just when you were sharing there, I couldn't help but wonder, if everything was easy, do you have hope, or is it more in the optimism camp? Because I think hope, for me, innately, is that the desire and longing for something to be different than it is.
I think what can be most inspiring about a person as well is when we know they've been through something and yet they still have it. It's easy to hear from someone who may have, the old silver spoon scenario to say everything's going to be great, but to know someone's been through difficulty is much more inspiring.
Yeah, and I think that sense of suffering, what produces character? Getting everything you want? I see it with my kids all the time. You give them something and it's like, oh, that lolly was fine, but you have a bigger lolly. Because and the point being that if you don't get what you want, then you have to actually amend yourself with God's grace and guidance. And sometimes, it's not pleasant. I want to contextualize all of this discussion though. There's a lot of nihilism in our society at the moment. There's a lot of and this was the kind of stuff I espoused in my 30s, was the sort of like the elegant despair of the agreeable, thoughtful person. It's like, actually, we have to fight that because we've got something that is galvanizing. And I think to be able to walk up to it and embrace it every day it's a challenge. It's our challenge as followers of Christ.
And I think, too, there's been an acknowledgement already of recognizing what our nature is, or two natures, I suppose you might say, that the Bible outlines this fact that we have this one nature that, aspires to be like Christ and to live in that hope and that grace and that peace, and yet we're all on a journey here. And we see, maybe in the media, and maybe it's come out of our own mouths, that tendency to fixate on the negative, to say, look, the country's stuffed. We've never been in a worse situation because of XYZ.
Yeah, that's right. Sorry, and back to your thought before, the choosing of hope, and the choosing of it. Every day we are hearing of, and just drawing probably a difference between a spirit of negativism and people who genuinely cannot put food on the table, people who are genuinely being squeezed from every side right now, and the pressure that they're going through, forced to make impossible decisions of petrol and food or heating and a doctor's visit and those sorts of things. And so I think we've got to remember that in those moments, which is the reality of something like 12% of our adult population, 450,000 New Zealanders, what and how do we bring hope into that grind in it? And I know for the team on our end who are working with that, the role of encouragement, the role of making a plan that works, walking alongside people, that's where hope starts to break through. And I I often talk about with the team that hope doesn't start the moment that you go debt free, in terms of the Christians Against Poverty journey. Hope usually enters someone's situation the moment that they got someone who can walk alongside them. And so I often talk about the team as being agents of hope.
Yeah.
Someone who can sit there and encourage and just start to be present and encourage them and let them know that there is a way out. There is someone who cares for them, and there's a way for the situation to change. And that is where we see hope break into those situations.
Yeah, in case people have only just tuned in and figured this out over the last little while, the reason for our hope is not just because of how clever we are, but because of course, we know of a God who loves us, cares for us, and gives us a way of hoping in a situation where maybe otherwise naturally we wouldn't hope. And I think what can also cause a sense of, dare I say, despair among, say, the wider Christian population in New Zealand as we think about how churches are perceived and whether or not we're even seen as a place where people find that hope. Now, fortunately, I'd have to say, Hana, for the Salvation Army, I would say you're in a uniquely blessed position in that in New Zealand, I feel like the Salvation Army has still one of the best reputations for being there to help people as a place of hope, and yet also in a spiritual and faith-based context. What's your sense of how churches and maybe faith organizations are also perceived? Are they seen as that place of hope, or what's come out of your discussions?
Sometimes the churches themselves don't even see themselves as a place of hope, actually. And I've had discussions with some places, with some people from different churches around the country, in that sense of, oh man, are we just looking after our own, or do we have something to offer outside of this in-house crowd? You know what I mean? And so I think you're absolutely right. The Salvation Army has this amazing legacy that I'm so proud to be part of. I'm so grateful to be part of. And it just makes practical sense when you read the Bible and you have a look at, or what the word says. And I think also there's something about what was being said before that sometimes there is a place to call out the things that are not okay. So on one hand, yes, we have a team of social workers, we have transitional housing and Kai and all of those things, yep. But also at the same time, the Social Policy and Parliamentary Unit of the Salvation Army is gathering that information and those stories and actually coming back into the places that have power to change policies that make a difference systemically, right? So you've got both of those arms happening. And so being in the public square. And some churches, when I speak to people, they've forgotten how to enter into the public square. They've forgotten this gift and this tradition that is so, so, so beautiful and important is the salt and the light in those places. They are the salt and the light in those places if they would dare to go into them, into the schools and into local government or wherever, and actually be salt and light. And I think it's such an important thing to remember, because it's not as if it hasn't always been there.
Oh, that's so good. Look, we're going to continue this discussion then too on how we do nurture that sense of the church and we as the wider faith community being that bastion of hope in a place that can offer battle with hopelessness. So if you want to be a part of our conversation this morning too, you're welcome to text through 8168 with the first word REMA. If you'd like to raise an issue with our panel talking about hope this morning, we'd love to hear from you. But back very shortly to continue this discussion about being salt and light, hope in a world that really needs it.
Breakfast on REMA, your Christian radio station.
God Today, I'm Alison Shaw.
2020 on Rima. Your nation, your voice.
Joining me in the studio, we have Tim Wilson, Hana Seddon, and Sam Garaway, all discussing hope. Do we have a reason to be hopeful? And just before the break, Tim, we were starting to talk about this idea of faith in the marketplace, hope in the marketplace, in the world that we live in.
Yeah, and I guess the question is, how do we actually do that? And I guess, say, for example, at Maxim Institute, when we come across people we don't agree with, we have to see the image of Christ in people we just. It's quite annoying, actually, because I used to be in media. And all you have to do is be provocative. But and I'm not saying that you're provocative.
Oh, so you're not saying that I am?
No.
What are you saying, Tim? What are you trying to say?
What I'm saying is you're building a great wairua in this studio. But the point being that it would be just like, say the most provocative thing, and then you get everyone's attention. But now at Maxim, being there, I have to say something that, as I say, is actually takes into account my understanding of the person I disagree with actually being loved by God as much as I'm loved by God. And also then I have to come up with something that is additional to that, which is how do we make this situation better? And that's the constant challenge for us at Maxim Institute with our policy, with our research, policy suggestions, but also with the internship, with the Sir John Graham lecture that we had just the other week. We brought a guy out from Oxford talking about the erosion of trust in government and how elites or those who lead us need to be able to renew themselves in a way that brings everyone in. So it's not just our leaders making policy for themselves and those people they know, but the 12% that you were referring to, Sam, who actually don't always get a voice. They need to get a voice. If they're heard, they'll feel included. If they feel included, they'll get a sense of that hope.
I'm inspired too, even as you say that. We can often forget the difference in the Christian model of leadership and what that looks like, how even offensive that was to the ancient world when it was first declared, and still is offensive to us today, the idea of a servant leader as opposed to, say, the ego-driven leader.
Not saying I don't get it right. I get it right all the time.
Yeah, but Sam, what comes to mind for you when you're thinking about this idea of what it means to be in the marketplace, being that beacon of hope?
Yeah, one of our biggest learnings probably comes back to where the word talks about by your fruit you shall know them.
Sure.
And over the last few years, the team at CAP has been doing more work with government departments, with agencies, collaborating with Hana's crowd over at SPPU from the Salvation Army on a few things. And time again, the thing that serves us is being evidence-based in what we're talking about. And I know that might sound like quite an unspiritual response, but certainly in our fields, like, we are 100% confidently Christian. It's in our name. It's in everything we do. It's in our posture.
Can you please never change your name? I love your name.
Tell you what, like, I feel the pressure of the name whenever I am in those meetings.
No kidding.
Whether it's with politicians, government departments, even down to the people who come and service your photocopier. What is their what is their
their experience of CAP?
Yeah, it's because it's so overt.
Yeah.
And so one thing that I think has served the team well is by your fruit you shall know them. And we share of evidence and impact, and we try our best to not speak to things that we're not experts on, that we don't speak to things that are beyond our lane. And in doing so, in our partnership model, there's 28 different denominations that we're working with. So even that, before you get to the marketplace, even that requires quite a lot of work to ensure that there's unity in that. But by your fruit you shall know them, and really bringing that to the marketplace has brought some fruit, some success.
Well, what stands out to me actually already in your thoughts, and I'd loved you, Hannah, to put a fence around this one if you possibly can, because although we aspire to be this beacon of hope too, I think sometimes we have to deal with the fact that we ourselves and even the organisations that we represent do not also live up to that. And within our organisations, we want to be there for people, but sometimes we even fall short in being this beacon of hope in these situations. And maybe it speaks to the need to build that relationship so that we can, maybe accommodate those failings when they turn up. But Hana, how have you approached that within Salvation Army? I'm sure we see all sides of humanity, the best and the worst.
All sides of humanity. And I think it's an interesting turn of phrase that you use, can I build a fence around it? What if we actually pulled some of the fences down? And that's really what we were getting to, isn't it?
Much better.
Pulling the fences down
Yeah.
and beginning to build relationships. One of the most powerful things that I've seen over the last 5-10 years and longer is refers to what Sam was talking about not being, recognizing when we're not experts and being able to get that expertise or that wisdom, that mātauranga from those who do. And one of the most powerful areas I've seen that happen is in Te Ao Māori. And so all of a sudden people have gone, oh, actually this is important. The treaty is a covenant. How do we act as a covenant partner or a marriage partner in this situation? And there's things that we just simply don't know about. And one of the most beautiful comments that I had was from the chair of Te Tii Marae saying, you know what? I've just noticed over the last 10 years a real influx of Christians. They keep coming up here to Waitangi.
Wow.
And even as we were just talking, actually, my phone, my email, not that I was reading it, someone was inquiring about going up to Waitangi again. And so what we've seen is the Spirit unifying us around our history, our context, and asking us to sometimes get uncomfortable with our story, but and all of it is to be reconciled with one another, to be reconciled with our story, and to be reconciled with God. And I think there's something really, really powerful about that. Where people have done that well, where they've taken up the challenge, you've just seen so many layers of healing and relationships between people that would never usually hang out, and just mutual benefits for those communities where that has happened.
Wow. I mean, how could you not be hopeful with stories like this? Of course, the reality is we all know quite easily. There's something about human nature, our own journeys with Christ, that we realize this is something we need to work on.
Well, I think even when we think about our context in Aotearoa, New Zealand, in terms of and I don't want to be the guy sucking the fun here, but in terms of the way that religious experience is able to be expressed in the public square, we're not really that comfortable in this country with that stuff. So, for example, in the United States, you cannot be elected president of the United States unless you claim a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. If you claim a personal relationship with Jesus Christ in Aotearoa, New Zealand, you are highly unlikely currently to be elected Prime Minister. And I think, you look at, for example, literature. Do we have a tradition of religious literature? No, we don't in this country, because it's seen as a private matter. So there is a real, I guess it's a bit of grinding that we need to do to get that work. We need to be as wise as serpents and as gentle as doves.
Yeah.
So I think that's just something I want to underline there.
Yeah.
I would just, off the back of that, I would just encourage us. I know that, coming back to, think of the name of the Salvation Army, like one of the strongest brands in social service development and that. And I know that when we come across our name and brand, one of the most common questions I get from Christians, particularly over the last few years, we've been doing some more work in the marketplace, is because we're pretty overtly evangelical, if you're listening and you didn't know much about CAP, in terms of our kaupapa of sharing the message of
That's
Jesus.
Christians Against Poverty, by the way, in case you hadn't connected the dots on that one.
Christians Against Poverty. And so in that, one of the most common questions I get asked is, but why do they want to work with you? But isn't that a barrier? Isn't the name a barrier? Isn't the fact that your kaupapa is, and we're overtly sharing Jesus in our work, isn't that a barrier? And my response over the time is starting to be like, how do you mean? And I think that there is a narrative of, yes, it being unpopular, I'm going to miss out on opportunities. But back to what Hana was saying before, like the Spirit is alive and at work in this nation. And I am wanting to bring hope and help and freedom and thriving in the nation. And so I think I would want people listening to be encouraged to be confidently Christian. Now, that doesn't mean, there's some less than desirable examples of that over the years, but there is a beauty that when you're tuned into the Spirit and you're tuning in, the doors aren't slammed in our faces on it.
Well, we have a different view of, of humanity.
Yeah.
That we don't believe that human beings are a scourge. In fact, they're created in the image of God, and each of us are unique in God's eyes. And there, I can't think of any other, I was about to say worldview, but just that understands us so uniquely and beautifully, and the phrase "we are loved into being." We carry all that when we sit down with people, and it's a message that needs to be heard when I'm talking about the atmosphere of nihilism, of hopelessness that is abroad in the country at the moment. It's like a beacon.
Yeah, and the fact that you bring that to mind as well tells me, Tim, you've obviously done a little work in your own life to make sure that you are able to stay hopeful. You've given yourself the evidence to do so. And Hana, I want to hear from you as well. Like, what are some things that you've done personally that have helped you develop a character attribute of hope?
Well, some of the hardest things is being willing to have an honest assessment of what's actually going on in a situation, in a context, in a place, and then being willing to act on that, right? And that sounds easy until it has flack, until there's a cost. And then we often go, oh, no, we'll leave that for the next person. And then we move on to something that's far prettier and, like better for social media. But all these things that will never, ever end up in social media are the things where we have to remove the rocks in the ground, break up hard ground. That's back-breaking work. So for me, I'm really blessed, I suppose is the word, that God has given this desire to really do the back-breaking work, because that takes a long time, and sometimes even in your own lifetime, you actually get to see the fruit come from that. And I'll give you one example. In the context where I'm working at the moment, I've just been praying and asking that the Lord would bring the kind of people that we need to be connecting with the people that we see in our community in Rotorua, which, 90% of the whānau that come in to see us every week are Māori. And so, how do we reshape and change things here in a way that means that when people walk in the door, they see themselves here, and there's hope even in that one thing, that they see Māori participating, that they see Māori leading, that they see Māori who have language, reo, waiata, these things that are still in our DNA and in our memory. And so what's happened over time is this incredible God-given shift where I've been praying for a long time, and people have literally walked in the door and gone, hey, this might sound weird, but I really felt like God asked me to come here. I don't even know if you've got any jobs going, and I don't really need anything, but I just feel like we need to be in your corner and have your back.
Wow.
And so, and I have this exact background, and that happened to match this exact JD I was just about to put online, And so this team has actually become probably 90% of the team Māori and mostly Christian. And therefore, that actually changes the whole dynamic of how you work with people. So you don't Bible bash, but the way that we speak and what we pray over people and how we journey with them makes them hungry. Like, what is this all about? Why are you guys like this? And it has brought some transformation that, it was hard to get to that place. It's been hard to get to that place it is. So from my own experiences, that sometimes where you are right now, you might want to take a look and see what are the things that God's asking you to address and to work through so that the fruit will come.
Yeah.
Wow.
Preach the gospel at all times, and if necessary, use words.
Use words.
That's it. Sam, what was on your mind when we're talking about this idea of how we nurture hope in our own lives, and realizing that it often takes some exercise of the will as opposed to just maybe a mental acknowledgement of some of the principles we live by? How have you gone about building that character trait of hope in your own world?
Yeah, great question. I think there's this phrase that I came across several years back now, that God begins where we end. And I think the idea that we are able to acknowledge when we're at the end of ourselves rather than be grasping for something really forces us back into that place of like, what are we hoping in? Where does our hope come from? Why should I be hopeful? Because particularly in our social cultural context, if it's all about us and our skills and our ability and what we're capable of, well, I'm pretty flawed. I'm not going to have much hope.
Your wife tells us that all the time.
yeah, right. So I think the practice for me personally in my work and in my leadership and my humanity is God begins where I end, and figuring out how to become really comfortable in that place. It's not always easy because it's uncomfortable. And then surrounding yourself with good people who can give you an alternative perspective to what the story in your head is right now. And I think diverse people, diverse thoughts, making sure you're not in an echo chamber, and actually, which really, like, this is a picture of the church, right? This is acknowledging being a faith community. This is acknowledging have people around us and seeking input from people. So not being alone, and acknowledging that God begins where we end.
Yeah, you remind me of the paradox of our faith that I think is a lifelong challenge. The Bible talks about, we're weak when we're strong. And I think we have a tendency to go one way or the other. People read that verse and go like, oh, so I've got to be weak all the time. Okay, I'll go for that. And say, oh, I'm supposed to be strong all the time. So no, there's this weird kind of tension in recognizing that we are both weak and strong. But it's, I think you said it beautifully, that God begins where we end. And we're not quite at the end yet, though. So if you do have some thoughts you want to run past our panel for our discussion on hope, please get in touch with us this morning, 8168 with the first word Rima. When we do come back, though, I don't know if you guys have heard there is an election on. I would love to get thoughts from you about how you're approaching this in your own world and how we as Christians can still be hopeful when there is voting to be done.
Election 2020. connection conversation on Rima.
And what a great time we've had this morning talking about hope, reasons to be hopeful, how we develop hope. And before we went to the break as well, we're about to head into a conversation around hope, also based on the unity within the church and, wider church organizations too. And Hana, I know this is something that you're very passionate about. What comes to mind for you when we think about the sense of hope and what it means to have unity amongst the brethren, shall we call them?
Well, going back to a conversation before about removing the fences, sometimes as people, as denominations or organizations, the system can be set up to create competition. And so, for example, CAP might go for some funding and Salvation Army might go for some funding. And so there's this competitive model. But also I think that can happen in the church or just in terms of people. We've got the best music. We've got the coolest worship team. This is not our church, by the way. There's all these different...
I'm Catholic. We've got,
I
some
hear
great
you.
people.
I hear you.
But, sometimes the singing could improve at Mass. I know I could improve it. Sorry, Hannah, please carry on.
No, but yeah, exactly right. So I think there's just so much diversity and richness, though, in that if you, instead of seeing it as a competition and who's got the market on who the Holy Spirit is, who God is, and the plan, if we actually saw that we were all part of that and began to collaborate more and work with each other more, because we all
Wait,
have
Hannah, are you saying we're like the body of Christ?
Well,
like
I know.
The
I thought I'd
hand
heard
doesn't
of it
have to
somewhere
be a
before.
foot. But I want to be a hand. No, it's so true.
Yeah, well, there you go. So, if we actually work together, then things would flow a lot better, and that creates more hope. Where you see these moments in these places where there's collaboration. I'll give you an example. I got to go over to Canada in May, and over there I went to an Indigenous theological symposium where people from all around the world came together as Christians to talk about their faith from their unique cultural perspectives. And it reminded me just how much Aotearoa New Zealand has to give to that conversation, that we don't just have our eyes down on what's going on in this beautiful place, but actually that some of our learnings and some of the things that work for us here as we're exploring, that they could actually be really helpful in many of these other countries as well. And I just think that the Bible's really clear, the body of Christ, but also where there's unity, the Lord commands a blessing. And I think that's hopeful too, that he would bless our endeavours, bless us being brought together in that way.
Yeah. Hannah, I know for me, right, laying my cards on the table around how hopeful I am, I believe that we can significantly change the experience of poverty and hardship in Aotearoa, and it will only be possible in terms of collaboration and partnership and togetherness. And I'm talking together as the church, together as organisations, together as Christians. That is where we will see the kingdom of God break through and thriving in this nation. And for me, the biggest barrier, and you touched on it so well there, Hannah, is a siloed thinking, or where people are building their own kingdoms rather than building the kingdom. And that might look like just trying to reinvent things or do it our way, rather than learning, rather than supporting, rather than encouraging other entities, organisations and people. And so I think that is the one thing that we need to protect if we're talking about this hope for the future, is ensuring we don't end up siloed, doing our own thing and reinventing something happening on the other side of town, or we're just going to miss the point.
I think there's a sense too of as we're in a look. There's a guy called Aaron Wren in the States who talks about when being Christian publicly was positive. So and then there was a period of Christian neutral. So the general tenor of public life is sort of Christian neutral. Now it's Christian negative. But as the church becomes a kind of remnant, I think you have more in common with other Christians than you actually had anticipated when there was more socialized Christianity. So I think that I would encourage us to continue to embrace that hope, even as we see society moving away from Christianity as a way of expressing social status, etc., etc. When it's not that, I think some incredible things will be unlocked.
And so before we go this morning, of course, it's been building towards an election for a few weeks now. One of the reasons why we wanted to have our final discussion on hope was, of course, because when it comes to voting, it's one of those funny things, can prompt some mixed emotions. And I'm not going to ask each of you to tell me who you're voting for, but I do want to know, when you look at an election and the future of a country, politically speaking, how do you approach it, hopefully, Tim?
Yeah, I'm looking at this in some sense as a bit of a distrust election. It's almost as if people are going, it's not which politician do I trust, but which one do I distrust the least.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at which politician, through the way they conduct themselves, through the way that they speak about their opposites, etc., they build up trust in the institution of democracy, because I think that's crucial. We've seen erosions of that over the past few years, and generally even before that. So I'm looking for that in the person or party that I vote for, and I'm encouraged by the preoccupation with education in this election, because education is the future of our country, and if we don't pay attention to that, we don't just sell kids down the river, we sell ourselves down the river and our economy. Everything's connected to that. So I'm encouraged by the preoccupation with education.
Yeah, we're concerned about the right things, at least. Sam, what comes to mind for you with this election?
Yeah, I think, Tim, you put that so well around the role of trust in the voting. For me, I probably approach things from quite a policy lens, so I do a bit of a deep dive into policies and those sorts of things. I probably have, as you said, sort of a concern around just the role of media and the lightning rods that go to certain topics that are dialed up to be significant, become a political football, when actually what's the real issue behind it. And so I would be encouraging everyone, and myself included, just to look past the headlines and making our decisions around voting, and ensure that we're making informed decisions and doing the work to understand what's going to bring about the change that we want to be part of. And I think education, certainly from our point of view, both major political parties coming out with their support of teaching financial literacy in schools, huge step forward that the team at CAP would be behind that decision.
You guys would love that.
So, yeah.
We can have a debate about this, though, because I think the curriculum's too big.
Well,
Anyway.
yeah, look, that's all right. That is that. So I think, but knowing what's in there and what you're voting for beyond just the media headlines, I think, so important when it comes to approaching your vote.
Hana, what stands out to you?
Oh, so many things. I was just thinking of Paulo Freire, who wrote a lot and spoke about this idea of the pedagogy of the oppressed, the education of those who have been oppressed. And what he was saying was basically education is one of those tools that will really set you free. And as you set yourself free from that dynamic of oppression, you also set the oppressor free. And so I agree that there's a real need for education that unlocks and frees people who have been stuck in circumstances. I was preaching on a passage from the Exodus about people whose home had become slavery after 400 years. They were generation after generation. We read 400 years and we're like, oh, that's a long time. No, that's twice as many as long as settlers have been in Aotearoa that came from England or Ireland, like my ancestors. And or 1,000 years on my Māori side. But what I'm saying is that there are things that need to be unlocked and undone, and education's a really big, important part of that. And I tend to agree with the need for having an understanding of what the party's policies are, because those policies create systems that our churches and our social services and what have you, our schools, have to live within. That environment is created by policy. So that's really, really important. So even as an educational or as an education for ourselves, to go and learn more about people's stance in terms of policy. I think there's some new players out there too. New Zeal is a party that's recently launched with Alfred Ngaro coming into the scene as a Christian party, really. And so there's some new parties out there, as well as the Māori Party, who are also, have some really interesting policies that are about the thriving of Māori. So I think there's lots for us to have a look at. But as what has been said before, no matter what happens, no matter what the outcome of the decision, right, we continue on. If you look at it generationally, we will survive whatever the decision is. We will carry on.
Yeah.
And that's something to be hopeful about too, Hana, in the sense that we live in a country where if the government loses, they will leave the ninth floor of the beehive. Other countries, that doesn't necessarily happen automatically. So that institution is important to uphold.
And all of the government departments, they don't change and turn over at an election.
No.
Like they're unchanged in their leadership and what's going on
I've
there.
got some thoughts on some of the departments, but let's go.
Look, not pro or con, but just making sure we understand the practicalities
exactly.
of that.
There is a mechanism that is there in place to ensure that transition ideally is smooth and delivers what people have chosen.
And as we come towards the close of this, at the risk of nailing my own colours to the mast or this kind of thing as well, I am reminded too of times in history where, the church did not have a voice. We were very much in the minority. We were an illegal, persecuted group of misfits and yet changed the world. And so as we come into this election, I would hope for people too to be reminded.
Andrew, we're still misfits, aren't we?
Yeah. Well, this is it, right? We believe in things that the world doesn't necessarily share in terms of, again, the value of the oppressed or of, the equality of every life, and to remember where these came from. Anyway, I'm inspired, and I'm so grateful that you guys joined us in studio today, Hana Seddon and Sam Garaway, also Tim Wilson. Thank you so much for coming in and sharing reasons to be hopeful today. And for those of you who've listened, I really appreciate you taking the time. Hopefully this has encouraged and inspired you. We will be posting this full conversation online. So here's a thought for you. If your small group's getting together over the next week or two, have a listen to a few thoughts and see what it sparks in you. Reasons to be hopeful. You have Christ in you, the hope of glory. And so with that said, thank you again for joining us for this conversation, and all the best with election 2023.
Think I'm gonna cave.